Everyone has group chats. Friends from college, co-workers, family members, fantasy football leagues, and conversations that slowly die but somehow never get deleted. Most of the time, they are just places where people share memes, argue about sports, and make plans that nobody ever follows through with. But every now and then, a notification appears that makes absolutely no sense. A message from someone who should not be texting, a photograph that nobody remembers taking, or a conversation that leaves everyone questioning what they thought they knew. These are 5 group chat horror stories that felt a little too real. Story 1. The last scene. 6 months after 21-year-old Jake Miller was killed in a car accident outside Columbus, Ohio, his friends had still not recovered from the loss. Jake had been the kind of person who kept everyone together. He organized road trips, remembered birthdays, and somehow managed to drag everyone out of the house even when nobody felt like doing anything. His death hit the group hard, and although life had continued, things had never really returned to normal. The old college group chat remained active, even though it wasn't used nearly as much anymore. Nobody had ever removed Jake's account. At first it felt wrong to do it. Eventually, it simply became one of those things nobody talked about. His name remained in the member list, frozen in time beside his old profile picture and the last message he had sent before the accident. One Friday evening, Ryan was sitting in his apartment watching a football game when his phone vibrated. Without thinking much about it, he glanced down and almost dropped the device. Jake Miller was typing. Ryan stared at the screen in disbelief. At first, he thought it had to be some sort of glitch. But after several seconds, a message appeared. The text itself was ordinary. It simply asked whether anyone was free the following weekend. But what unsettled Ryan wasn't the message. It was the account that had sent it. Within seconds, the entire group chat exploded with confusion. David assumed someone had hacked Jake's phone. Bilal insisted it had to be some kind of delayed message. Marcus thought perhaps Jake's younger brother had somehow gained access to the account. None of the explanations made much sense, but everyone desperately wanted one. Eventually, Ryan contacted Jake's parents. They sounded just as confused as everyone else. According to them, Jake's phone had been locked away in a drawer ever since the funeral. Nobody had touched it in months. That answer only made things worse. Over the following week, more messages appeared. They were never dramatic or threatening. In fact, they seemed strangely normal. Jake's account commented on football scores, sent memes, and occasionally asked what everyone had been up to. At first, the group tried to avoid responding, but human curiosity eventually got the better of them. Slowly, conversations resumed. Ryan hated himself for it, but after a while, he almost forgot who was sending the messages. Until one night, David mentioned a girl he had recently started seeing. Less than 30 seconds later, Jake's account replied with her name. The entire group chat went silent. Nobody had ever mentioned her before. David immediately demanded to know how anyone knew about her. The others were just as confused. Eventually, everyone agreed that one of them must have told Jake about her before the accident and simply forgotten. It was an uncomfortable explanation, but it was better than the alternative. Except the strange incidents kept happening. Bilal mentioned his plans to transfer colleges. Within seconds, Jake's account referenced the exact university he had secretly applied to. Marcus complained about his manager at work. Jake's account somehow knew the manager's first name. Every single time, the information was accurate. And every single time, nobody could explain how. The situation stopped feeling like some sick joke and started feeling deeply wrong. Then Ryan noticed something that made his stomach tighten. Whenever Jake's account sent a message, the last seen status updated. Active now. Not active 6 months ago. Not last online months earlier. Active now. Ryan spent almost an hour staring at that tiny line beneath Jake's name, hoping it would disappear. It didn't. Eventually, the friends agreed to meet in person. Nobody wanted to discuss it over text anymore. They met at a sports bar outside Columbus and spent nearly 3 hours trying to come up with explanations. Every possibility sounded ridiculous. A hacker, a family member, A delayed backup. Nothing fit. As they prepared to leave, Ryan looked around the table and realized something strange. Nobody had touched their phones in nearly an hour. Yet every device on the table suddenly vibrated at exactly the same moment. A new message had appeared, not from any member of the group, from Jake. And attached beneath the message was a photograph. The picture showed 5 men sitting around a table inside a sports bar. Ryan, David, Bilal, Marcus, and Tyler. The image had clearly been taken only seconds earlier, because the half-eaten fries were still sitting on the table, and none of them remembered seeing anyone with a camera. Over the next several days, the group tried to convince themselves that somebody inside the restaurant must have taken the photograph. Maybe another customer had recognized them. Maybe it had been some strange coincidence. None of them truly believed those explanations, but nobody wanted to say what they were actually thinking. The message itself was even stranger. Attached beneath the image was a single sentence asking why everyone had stopped hanging out without him. Tyler immediately left the group chat. Nobody blamed him. Ryan barely slept that night. The photograph kept replaying in his mind. He knew exactly where everyone had been sitting, and he knew none of them had noticed anyone taking a picture. What bothered him most, though, was the angle. The image had been captured from across the room, near the entrance. If someone had stood there holding a phone, at least one person should have noticed. The next morning, David suggested something they had all been avoiding. He wanted to visit Jake's parents. Nobody liked the idea, but eventually everyone agreed. Jake's mother greeted them warmly, although she looked confused by the unexpected visit. Ryan awkwardly explained everything, expecting her to laugh and dismiss the whole thing as some cruel prank. Instead, the color slowly drained from her face. Without saying a word, she disappeared upstairs. Several minutes later, she returned holding Jake's phone. The battery was dead. She explained that it had been dead since the day of the funeral. Nobody had charged it. Nobody had turned it on. It had remained untouched inside a bedside drawer for 6 months. Ryan examined the device himself. The screen remained black. Nothing. No power. No notifications. No explanation. Before leaving, Jake's father quietly mentioned something that made everyone uncomfortable. He admitted that strange things had been happening around the house recently. Television channels changing by themselves. Music playing through Bluetooth speakers. Missed calls appearing in their call history with no number attached. At first, they had blamed stress and grief. Now he wasn't so sure. That evening, Bilal finally snapped. He removed Jake from the group chat. Nobody argued. In fact, everyone felt relieved. For the first time in weeks, the group chat was silent. And it stayed silent. For 3 days. Then on the 4th morning, Ryan woke up to dozens of missed notifications. His stomach dropped. Jake was back. Somehow, the account had rejoined the group. Nobody had sent an invite. Nobody even knew how that was possible. Panic spread through the chat. Marcus insisted someone was messing with them. David wanted to contact the police. Bilal refused to even open the messages. Ryan forced himself to look. There were no new texts. Only photographs. 7 photographs. One after another. Ryan's hands began shaking as he opened them. The first showed Marcus asleep on his couch. The second showed Bilal lying in bed. The third showed David sitting at his desk. The fourth showed Tyler asleep in his apartment. The fifth showed Ryan himself, taken from the foot of his bed. The 6th picture showed Jake's parents sleeping in their bedroom. And the 7th picture caused Ryan's blood to turn cold. It had been taken inside a cemetery. The image showed 6 young men standing together in front of Jake's grave. Ryan, David, Bilal, Marcus, Tyler, and Jake. All 6 were smiling at the camera. But Ryan didn't remember ever visiting the cemetery with everyone. In fact, Tyler had moved to Florida 2 months earlier. And yet there he stood. The timestamp showed the photograph had been taken only 23 minutes earlier. Unable to breathe, Ryan immediately called the others. Everyone answered. Everyone sounded terrified, because they had all just received the exact same photograph. and every single one of them swore they had been asleep 23 minutes earlier. Nobody spoke in the group chat again after that. Eventually, the messages stopped. The account went silent. Months passed. Life slowly moved on. Until almost a year later, Ryan was scrolling through old pictures on his phone when he noticed something strange. One of the photographs from the restaurant had changed. Originally, it showed 5 friends sitting around the table. Now there were 6. And sitting quietly beside Ryan, smiling directly toward the camera, was Jake. Because somehow, the group chat had never removed him at all. Story 2. The wrong number. Emily Carter had just finished a 12-hour shift at a hospital in Austin, Texas, when her phone vibrated with a notification from an unknown group chat. At first, she assumed it was spam. Strange messages and random invitations were common enough, and she almost ignored it completely. But curiosity got the better of her, and before going to bed, she decided to open it. There were 6 people inside. None of the names meant anything to her. At first glance, the conversation looked completely ordinary. They talked about sports, complained about work, and shared pictures of food. Nobody seemed unusual. Nobody seemed threatening. In fact, they sounded like old friends who had known each other for years. Emily immediately assumed she had been added by mistake. She typed a quick message explaining that she didn't know any of them and asked if someone had entered the wrong number. Nobody responded. Instead, the conversation continued as though she had never said anything. At first, she thought the others simply hadn't seen the message. But over the next several hours, she repeated herself multiple times. Every single message was ignored. It wasn't like they were avoiding her. It genuinely felt as though her texts didn't exist. Eventually, Emily muted the conversation and went to sleep. The next morning, while drinking coffee before work, she opened the chat again out of curiosity. Something immediately caught her attention. One of the members had complained about a major traffic accident on Interstate 35. The message had been sent the previous night. Emily frowned, because according to the timestamp, the message had been sent almost 14 hours before the crash actually happened. At first, she dismissed it. Coincidences happened all the time. But throughout the day, she kept remembering the message. And that evening, another strange thing happened. The group chat started discussing a power outage affecting parts of downtown Austin. The members complained about restaurants closing early and traffic lights failing. Emily rolled her eyes. There was no outage. Everything around her looked perfectly normal. But less than 2 hours later, half the city suddenly lost power. By now, coincidence no longer felt like a satisfying answer. Over the next week, Emily became obsessed. She stopped muting the chat. Instead, she started reading every message carefully. And slowly, she noticed a pattern. Nothing they discussed happened immediately. Everything happened the following day. Minor things at first. Thunderstorms, road closures, sporting events. Then bigger things. A school bus accident, a chemical spill, a fire inside an apartment building. Every event unfolded exactly as the group members had casually discussed it. What disturbed Emily most was the tone. Nobody sounded surprised. Nobody treated these events as predictions. They simply talked about them as though they had already happened. One evening, unable to keep ignoring it, Emily finally decided to intervene. When the chat mentioned a gas explosion at a shopping center scheduled to happen the next afternoon, she immediately contacted the police. Nobody believed her. Without evidence, there was nothing they could do. The following day, the explosion happened exactly as described. Thankfully, nobody died. But Emily spent the entire afternoon shaking, because she had known. And somehow, 6 strangers had known too. Over the following days, her fear slowly turned into curiosity. She began asking questions. Who were they? How did they know these things? Why had she been added? For the first time since joining the chat, somebody finally acknowledged her existence. A member named Sarah simply welcomed her back and asked why she kept pretending she didn't recognize everyone. Emily sat frozen. Pretending? She had never spoken to these people before in her life. At least, that's what she believed. The other members seemed confused by her confusion. One by one, they casually referenced memories that supposedly involved her. Road trips, birthday parties, college football games, even embarrassing stories from years earlier. The details sounded oddly specific. Too specific. But Emily had absolutely no memory of any of it. Then somebody mentioned something that caused her stomach to tighten. According to the group, Emily had been the person who created the chat, and she had created it 8 years earlier. Terrified, she checked the information page. Her blood ran cold, because she wasn't listed as the newest member. She wasn't listed as recently added. According to the chat itself, Emily Carter had been there from the beginning. Unable to calm herself down, Emily spent the rest of the night searching through old backups and cloud storage accounts. She convinced herself there had to be some kind of explanation. Maybe somebody had stolen her identity. Maybe an old account had somehow been reactivated. But every possibility felt weaker than the last. The following morning, she called her younger sister, Megan. Emily explained everything and expected her to laugh at the situation. Instead, Megan became strangely quiet. After several seconds, she admitted something that immediately made Emily uncomfortable. Megan remembered hearing some of the names before. Not all of them, but enough. One of the names belonged to a man named Eric, and according to Megan, Emily used to mention him constantly during college. She remembered Emily talking about road trips and football games with him. The strange part was that Megan had not heard that name in years. Emily felt sick, because she had absolutely no idea who Eric was. Determined to prove her sister wrong, Emily drove to her mother's house and spent the entire afternoon going through old photo albums and storage boxes. Most of the pictures looked normal. Birthdays, vacations, family gatherings. Nothing unusual, until she reached a box containing photographs from her college years. As she flipped through them, her hands slowly stopped moving. There were faces she recognized, friends she remembered, but mixed among them were several strangers. And somehow, they weren't really strangers. They were the same people from the group chat. Sarah, Eric, Kevin, Ashley, all standing beside her, smiling, appearing completely natural. The dates written on the backs of the photographs stretched back almost 8 years. Her mother found her sitting on the floor surrounded by pictures. At first, she thought Emily had simply become emotional looking through old memories. But when Emily pointed toward one of the photographs and asked about the people standing beside her, the smile disappeared from her mother's face. Very quietly, her mother admitted she remembered them too. Not perfectly, but enough to know they had once been close friends. She remembered Emily mentioning their names. She remembered graduation parties. She even remembered Eric helping move furniture into Emily's first apartment. None of it made sense. Emily wasn't remembering forgotten friends. She wasn't remembering anything at all. It was as though 8 years of memories had been ripped away from her. Over the following week, she became consumed by the mystery. Every evening she returned to the chat and read years of old messages. Thousands upon thousands of conversations filled the archive. Pictures, jokes, plans, and arguments. And somehow, every message clearly showed her name among the participants. Yet she couldn't remember typing a single word. Eventually, she reached the oldest messages. They dated back exactly 8 years. The very first message had been sent by Emily herself. The message welcomed everyone to the group and mentioned how strange it would be to look back on the conversation years later. As disturbing as that was, something else terrified her even more. Because the very last message in the archive had not been sent recently. It had been sent 8 years ago, and according to the timestamp, nobody had written anything after that. Not until Emily received the notification 2 weeks earlier. Confused and terrified, she opened the final conversation. The group had been discussing a car accident. Not a future event. Not a random news story. Their own accident. The messages described heavy rain, a truck crossing the median, and 6 people trapped inside 2 vehicles. Then came dozens of frantic messages. And finally, silence. No more texts. No replies. Nothing. until one final message appeared, sent by Emily. The message apologized. It apologized for being the only one who survived. Emily's hands began shaking so badly she nearly dropped the phone. The date of the message matched exactly with the year she had undergone emergency surgery following a major crash. A crash her family had always described as involving another vehicle, not 5 close friends. Unable to breathe, Emily called her mother immediately. And for the first time in her life, her mother broke down crying. Because she admitted there had been 6 people in the car that night. Not one. But after the funerals, something had changed. Little by little, everyone stopped talking about them. Photographs disappeared. Names vanished. Memories faded. Eventually, nobody could remember them anymore. Nobody except Emily. Or so they thought. 3 nights later, Emily woke up to another notification. The group chat had become active again. A new member had joined. The profile picture was blank. The phone number was unknown. And the account name simply read, Megan. Emily stared at the screen in horror. Because her younger sister had died in a car accident 4 years earlier. And beneath the notification, a new message had already appeared. The message welcomed her to the group and gently asked why Emily kept pretending she didn't remember everyone. Story 3. Read receipts. For nearly 3 years, 5 employees working at a software company in Seattle, Washington had maintained a private group chat that existed for one reason and one reason only. It was where they complained. Long meetings, annoying clients, impossible deadlines, and the occasional joke at their manager's expense all ended up there. Ryan, Marcus, Kevin, David, and Ethan trusted each other completely, and because nobody outside the group knew it existed, they never worried about what they said. That changed on a Tuesday morning. Ryan arrived at work expecting another normal day, but instead found the entire office strangely quiet. People were whispering. Managers looked tense. And sitting inside everyone's inbox was a company-wide email from the department head. Attached to the email were screenshots. Dozens of screenshots. Private screenshots. The screenshots showed messages from the group chat. Embarrassing jokes. Complaints about management. Personal conversations. Everything. Within minutes, panic spread through the office. Nobody understood how it had happened. At first, everyone blamed Kevin. He was the most careless with technology, and Marcus assumed his account had been hacked. Kevin denied everything. Ryan checked his own phone and changed every password he had. David even contacted the company IT department. But after several hours, nobody had any answers. According to the message logs, nobody had forwarded the screenshots. Nobody had exported them. Nobody had accessed anyone's account. And yet somehow, the images had made their way directly to upper management. Miraculously, nobody was fired. The department head brushed it off as childish behavior and warned everyone to be more professional. But the damage had already been done. Trust inside the group was gone. For several days, the 5 friends barely spoke. Eventually, though, frustration turned into curiosity. Someone had to be responsible. And one evening, Ryan noticed something strange. Every message inside the chat had been read. Not unusual on its own. Except Kevin had been asleep. David was driving home. Marcus had been inside a meeting. And Ethan hadn't touched his phone in hours. Yet every message showed the same thing. Read. Ryan initially assumed it was just a bug, until he opened the read receipt information and discovered something impossible. 6 people had seen the message. Not 5. 6. Ryan stared at the screen in confusion. He checked older messages. 6 read receipts. Newer messages. 6 read receipts. Months of conversations. 6 read receipts. Yet there were only 5 members inside the chat. Unable to understand what he was seeing, Ryan sent screenshots to the others. At first, everyone assumed it was another software glitch. But when they checked their own devices, they found the exact same thing. 6 read receipts. 5 members. No explanation. Marcus suggested exporting the chat history. David thought perhaps an old account had never been removed. Kevin blamed some weird app update. But none of those explanations survived what happened next. Ethan sent a message asking if anyone else was starting to feel paranoid. 30 seconds later, another message appeared beneath it. Not from Ryan. Not from Marcus. Not from anyone they recognized. The account had no profile picture, no name, no phone number, no information at all. Yet somehow, the message appeared normally inside the chat. And according to the sender information, the account had been part of the group for over 2 years. Nobody moved. Nobody typed. Nobody even breathed. Because the message itself was strangely ordinary. It simply apologized for sharing the screenshots. And then it thanked everyone for finally noticing that it existed. The 5 friends spent the next hour trying to remove the account. But it couldn't be blocked. It couldn't be reported. And according to the member list, it wasn't there. The account only appeared when it sent a message. Nothing about it made sense. Eventually, Kevin suggested deleting the entire group chat. Everyone agreed. But before anyone could do it, another message appeared. The unknown account politely asked them not to. And then, without anyone sending a single text, 5 typing bubbles suddenly appeared, one after another, as though each member was writing something. But nobody was touching their phone. And slowly, message by message, the chat began typing for them. The 5 friends sat frozen, watching the messages appear one after another. Ryan's phone rested face up on his desk, yet sentences were being typed beneath his name without him touching the screen. Marcus immediately dropped his device onto the couch. Kevin turned his phone off completely. David deleted the app and reinstalled it. Nothing made any difference. The messages continued. What disturbed them most was how natural everything sounded. The conversations looked exactly like something they would say. Jokes, complaints, and sarcastic remarks appeared under each person's name. Anyone reading the chat would have assumed the group was having an ordinary conversation, except nobody was participating. Eventually, the messages stopped. For almost an hour, silence returned. Then the unknown account sent another message. It apologized again. According to the message, it had simply become lonely. Nobody slept much that night. The following morning, Ryan arrived at work exhausted. He intended to tell himself it had all been some kind of elaborate prank, but that explanation vanished before lunch. Marcus called him in a panic. Without warning, the unknown account had started replying to conversations taking place outside the group chat. When Kevin complained about the office coffee machine in person, a message appeared criticizing the same machine. When David joked about quitting his job during lunch, another message referenced it less than 30 seconds later. Nobody had typed anything. Nobody had even touched their phones. Yet somehow, the account knew. Over the next several days, things became worse. The messages became more personal. The account referenced television shows people were watching inside their apartments. It mentioned food sitting on kitchen counters. It brought up arguments with girlfriends. Every detail was accurate. Eventually, Ryan decided to conduct an experiment. He drove alone to a park on the outskirts of Seattle and left his phone inside the car. After walking nearly half a mile away, he quietly spoke a random sentence out loud. Nobody was around. Nobody could hear him. 30 seconds later, his phone vibrated. The unknown account repeated the exact sentence. Word for word. Ryan nearly crashed the car driving home. By now, nobody cared about who had leaked the screenshots. They just wanted it to stop. Marcus threw his phone into a lake. Kevin bought a brand new device. David switched phone numbers entirely. And Ethan deleted every social media account he owned. Nothing changed, because the messages still appeared. No matter what they did, the account followed. Weeks passed. Eventually, they stopped talking about it. Not because they accepted it, but because they were exhausted. Then one evening, Ryan noticed something strange. The unknown account had stopped sending messages. At first, he felt relieved, until he checked the read receipts. There were no longer 6. There were only 5. For the first time in months, the extra red receipt had vanished. Ryan immediately contacted the others. Everyone felt the same relief. Maybe whatever had been happening was finally over. Maybe it had left. 3 days later, Ethan failed to show up for work. Nobody could reach him. His apartment was empty. His car remained parked outside. Police became involved, but there was no evidence of foul play. It was as though he had simply disappeared. Weeks turned into months. Life slowly moved on. People changed jobs. The group chat eventually became inactive. And little by little, Ethan stopped coming up in conversations. Not intentionally. People just forgot. Almost a year later, Ryan was scrolling through old messages when he noticed something strange. There were only 4 names in the member list. Ryan, Marcus, Kevin, David. He frowned. Something felt wrong. He knew there used to be 5 people, didn't there? Then he opened the read receipt information beneath an old message. 4 members had seen it, but the number at the bottom showed 5. Ryan stared at the screen, because there it was again, an extra read receipt. No name, no account, nothing, just a 5th pair of eyes. And after nearly a year of silence, a typing bubble appeared, followed by a message. The unknown account gently apologized for the confusion. According to the message, nobody had disappeared. Nobody had been removed. It explained that everyone eventually forgot who the 6th member was. And it thanked Ryan for remembering Ethan for as long as he had. Ryan sat motionless, reading the message over and over. Because until that exact moment, he had completely forgotten Ethan existed. And somehow, the chat had noticed before he did. Story 4, The Archived Chat. David Reynolds never intended to buy a used phone. His old one had shattered after slipping out of his pocket in a grocery store parking lot, and with money being tight, he decided to pick up a cheap replacement from a pawn shop in Phoenix, Arizona. The device looked practically new. The employee assured him it had been wiped clean and factory reset, and after transferring his contacts and apps, David quickly forgot the phone had ever belonged to someone else. For nearly 2 weeks, nothing unusual happened. Then one evening, while organizing some files, David accidentally opened an old messaging app he didn't remember installing. At first, he assumed it had downloaded automatically with one of the backups. But what caught his attention was an archived group chat buried at the bottom of the screen. The group had no title, no profile picture, and no visible phone numbers. Just 6 names: Ryan, Kevin, Marcus, Ethan, Tyler, and Jessica. Curious, David opened it. The messages stretched back years. At first, he found the entire thing amusing. The 6 friends joked constantly. They argued about football, complained about work, and made plans that nobody seemed to follow through with. Reading through the messages almost felt like watching an old television show. David figured he had stumbled onto some strangers' forgotten memories. But after a few days, something began bothering him. The dates. According to the app, the newest messages were over 3 years old. And yet some of the conversations felt strangely familiar. One message complained about road construction outside an apartment complex. David frowned because road crews had spent the entire week working outside his own apartment. Another message mentioned somebody's golden retriever refusing to stop barking at the mailman. David owned a golden retriever. Its name was Cooper. Still, he convinced himself it was coincidence. Millions of people owned dogs. Millions of apartments had construction. None of it meant anything. At least, that's what he kept telling himself. Then one night, while eating dinner on his couch, he came across another conversation. Jessica had complained about her upstairs neighbor vacuuming after midnight. David slowly lowered his fork, because his upstairs neighbor had been vacuuming almost every night that week. Even stranger, the message had been sent 3 years earlier. He laughed nervously and continued scrolling. The next message caused the smile to disappear from his face. Tyler complained about a water stain spreading across the kitchen ceiling. David immediately looked up. A small brown stain had appeared above his sink 2 days earlier. For the first time, he put the phone down. Something about all of this felt wrong. Over the next week, curiosity slowly turned into obsession. Every evening after work, David found himself returning to the archived chat. The conversations were ordinary, but they seemed to mirror his own life with disturbing accuracy. A difficult customer at work, a package delivered to the wrong address, the neighbor's barking dog, even Cooper throwing up on the living room rug. Every detail eventually happened, sometimes days later, sometimes hours later, but always exactly as described. Eventually, David stopped reading old messages for entertainment. He started reading them as warnings. And for a while, it worked. When the chat mentioned a burst pipe, he contacted maintenance before any damage could happen. When the messages talked about a power outage, he stocked up on batteries. Little by little, he began relying on them, which was exactly when things changed. One night, David reached the oldest unread section. Unlike the rest of the archive, these messages felt different. The conversations had become tense. Nobody joked anymore. Everyone sounded frightened. According to the timestamps, the messages were still 3 years old, but they were discussing things that had not happened yet. His apartment, his dog, his job, and eventually, they started talking about him. David froze, because none of the 6 names belonged to him, and yet every message referred to someone named David. According to the conversation, David had just bought a used phone from a pawn shop in Phoenix, and the others sounded terrified that he had opened the archive. Then Ryan sent a message asking the question that caused David's stomach to tighten. He wanted to know whether David had already reached this part of the conversation, because according to Ryan, that was where everything had started. Unable to sleep, David spent the rest of the night reading. Every instinct told him to throw the phone away, but curiosity kept pulling him back. The 6 friends inside the archive chat sounded increasingly desperate. The casual conversations from earlier messages had completely disappeared. In their place were warnings, arguments, and frantic attempts to understand something none of them could explain. What unsettled David most was how aware they seemed to be. They weren't discussing a stranger. They were discussing him. Ryan repeatedly mentioned that David would eventually reach the unread section. Marcus insisted they should delete the archive before that happened. Jessica argued that it didn't matter anymore because the damage had already been done. None of it made sense. The messages were 3 years old. They shouldn't have known he existed. And yet they described his life with impossible accuracy. David called his friend Ryan the next morning, hoping somebody in the real world could help him think rationally. But after hearing the story, Ryan laughed and assumed the whole thing was an elaborate prank. He suggested throwing the phone in the trash and forgetting about it. David almost listened. Almost. But later that evening, another message inside the archive caught his attention. It mentioned Cooper, not just his dog, his name. The message explained that Cooper would refuse to enter the spare bedroom after sunset. David slowly looked toward the hallway, because Cooper had started doing exactly that. For nearly a week, the dog would growl softly, stop at the doorway, and refuse to move any farther. David had laughed about it before. Now he couldn't. As the days passed, the messages became increasingly disturbing. They referenced little details nobody else could possibly know. A scratch on his car door, a headache he had ignored for days, a voicemail from his mother, even the exact movie playing on his television one evening. Eventually, David reached the final week of conversations. By then, all 6 members sounded exhausted. The messages no longer focused on his daily life. They focused on fear. According to the group, they had discovered the same archive chat years earlier. At first, they had treated it like a joke. Then they realized the messages described their lives. And eventually, the old messages had started mentioning another person. Someone none of them knew. A man named David Reynolds. The exact same David now reading the conversation. Ryan desperately wanted to know if they could warn him. Jessica argued that it was impossible. Marcus believed they should simply stop reading. But Ethan insisted that they owed David the truth. The group spent days arguing. Then, suddenly, the conversations changed. Panic replaced arguments. According to the timestamps, they had all begun hearing notification sounds coming from phones that were turned off. Tyler claimed he could hear typing noises in empty rooms. Jessica admitted she had started receiving calls from numbers that didn't exist. And one by one, the members began disappearing from the chat. Not leaving, disappearing. Their names remained, but their messages slowly vanished. Until eventually, only Ryan remained. His final messages stretched across several days. At first, he sounded calm, then tired, then terrified. His last message explained that he no longer remembered the others clearly. He remembered names, faces, pieces of conversations. But every day, those memories faded a little more. Before signing off, Ryan wrote one final warning. He begged David not to finish reading, because according to him, reaching the last message completed something. David stared at the screen. There was only one unread message remaining. Against every instinct, he opened it. His blood turned cold, because the message wasn't 3 years old. It had been sent 1 minute earlier, and it wasn't from Ryan, or Marcus, or anyone else. The sender name simply read, David. Hands shaking, he opened it. The message was short. It thanked him for continuing the chain, and it apologized, because according to the message, somebody else would eventually buy his phone. Someone who would find the archive. Someone whose name had already appeared in conversations David hadn't even written yet. Panicking, David smashed the device with a hammer. He buried the pieces in a dumpster behind his apartment complex and spent weeks convincing himself it was over. Months passed. Life slowly returned to normal, until one afternoon, while visiting his mother, she asked an innocent question. She wanted to know what had happened to Cooper. David frowned, because Cooper was asleep in the living room. At least, he thought he was. But his mother looked genuinely confused. Very quietly, she admitted she didn't remember David ever owning a dog. That night, David rushed home. The water bowl was gone. The dog bed was gone. The chew toys had disappeared. And every photograph inside his phone gallery showed an empty spot where Cooper should have been. Unable to breathe, David opened his contacts. There was no veterinarian, no pet insurance, nothing, as though Cooper had never existed. Then his new phone vibrated. It wasn't a text message. It wasn't a call. It was a notification from an app he had never installed. An archive group chat. And according to the member list, there were now 7 names. Ryan, Kevin, Marcus, Ethan, Tyler, Jessica, and Cooper. Story 5. Removed from the group. For nearly a decade, 7 friends from Nashville, Tennessee had kept the same group chat alive. It had started back in college and somehow survived weddings, new jobs, and people moving across the country. Although everyone had grown older, the group chat remained the one place where they all stayed connected. Birthdays, football games, jokes, and old memories eventually found their way there. Michael Sanders had always considered it one of the few things in life that never changed. That was why he immediately noticed when Kevin disappeared. There was no goodbye, no argument, no explanation. One day, Kevin simply wasn't there anymore. At first, Michael assumed he had left voluntarily. Group chats became overwhelming sometimes, and Kevin had never been particularly active anyway. But when Michael asked the others about it, everyone looked confused. Nobody remembered removing him. In fact, nobody seemed particularly concerned. Marcus casually stated that there had only ever been 6 people in the group. Michael laughed, assuming they were joking, but nobody laughed back. Uneasy, he searched his contacts. Kevin's number was gone. Old text conversations had disappeared. Even photographs on social media showed no sign of him. It felt wrong. Not impossible, just wrong. Michael remembered road trips with Kevin. He remembered football Sundays. He remembered helping him move apartments. Yet somehow, nobody else seemed bothered. Eventually, Michael convinced himself that grief and stress were affecting his memory. Until 3 months later, Jessica disappeared. The pattern repeated itself perfectly. No notification, no argument, no announcement. One morning, Michael opened the chat and realized her name was missing. And once again, nobody else thought anything was unusual. This time, Michael refused to let it go. He drove to Marcus's house and demanded an explanation. Marcus genuinely looked concerned for him. He quietly suggested that maybe Michael had become obsessed with old memories. According to Marcus, there had never been anyone named Jessica in the group. Michael drove home feeling physically ill because Jessica had attended his wedding, or at least, he remembered her attending. Over the following weeks, Michael became consumed by paranoia. He searched old hard drives, cloud backups, and photo albums. Every single time, reality seemed to disagree with him. People disappeared, photographs changed, messages vanished, and every memory he held on to slowly became harder to picture. The terrifying part wasn't the disappearing names. It was the forgetting. Every day, details became harder to recall. Faces blurred, voices faded, memories weakened, until eventually, Michael wasn't entirely sure what Kevin had looked like anymore. And that realization terrified him more than anything else. One evening, unable to sleep, he began scrolling through the oldest messages in the group chat. Years of jokes and conversations stretched endlessly into the past. At first, nothing stood out. Then he noticed something strange. The member count. 7 people, but only 5 names appeared. Michael frowned. Something wasn't adding up. He counted again. 5 names. 7 members. His heart started pounding. He checked older messages. 7 members. 5 names. The number never changed. Only the names did. And buried deep in the oldest conversations, Michael found screenshots. Not screenshots he remembered taking. Screenshots of the group chat itself. Inside those screenshots were names that no longer existed. Kevin, Jessica, and several others. Each screenshot captured a different version of the group. Different members, different profile pictures, different conversations. But every screenshot had one thing in common. Michael appeared in all of them, and each time someone vanished, everyone else seemed to forget, except him. By now, Michael had stopped trying to explain it. He only wanted answers. And then, one night, he finally received one. At 2 in the morning, his phone vibrated. A notification appeared at the top of the screen. Michael had been made group admin. The message underneath was even stranger. According to the app, nobody else remained. Michael stared at the screen for nearly a full minute, convinced the app had glitched. There was no way the group could be empty. Only an hour earlier, Marcus had been sending football memes and Ryan had been complaining about work. Yet according to the member list, nobody else remained. The group still contained years of messages, but every name had vanished. Only Michael's remained. Panic immediately took over. He called Marcus. The number did not exist. He called Ryan. Same result. David, Ashley, Tyler. Every number either failed or redirected him to strangers who had never heard those names before. Michael barely slept that night. By morning, he had convinced himself that some kind of technical problem had corrupted his contacts. But when he drove to Marcus's apartment, his stomach tightened. A different family lived there. They had lived there for 12 years. The woman who answered the door had never heard of Marcus. Michael returned to his car feeling sick. Over the following days, things only became worse. His social media friends list had shrunk. Old photographs looked different. Vacations he clearly remembered taking with his friends now showed empty chairs and strange gaps. In one picture from a beach trip, Michael appeared to be smiling towards somebody who no longer existed. And little by little, the memories themselves began fading. Ryan's face disappeared first, then Ashley's laugh. Eventually, Michael struggled to remember anyone's voice. He started writing names on sticky notes around his apartment, terrified that he would forget them completely. Every wall slowly became covered with reminders. Names, birthdays, places they had visited together. Anything to keep the memories alive. But each morning, the notes felt less meaningful. Eventually, even the names themselves stopped triggering memories. Then one evening, another notification appeared. Someone had joined the group. Michael's hands trembled. He immediately opened the chat. A new account had appeared. The profile picture was blank. The username simply read, Michael. He stared at it in confusion. Then another notification appeared. The new member had changed its profile picture. The image showed Michael sleeping in bed. It had clearly been taken the night before. Unable to breathe, Michael backed away from the phone. Then a message appeared. The account welcomed him to the group. Over the following days, more members began appearing. Not strangers, different versions of himself. One profile picture showed him as a child. Another showed him in college. One account used a photograph from his wedding. Each version carried a different date and profile picture, and every one of them seemed to know him. The messages were calm, polite, ordinary. They shared memories Michael no longer recognized. Old conversations, forgotten birthdays, people whose names meant nothing to him. Eventually, one of the older accounts asked a question. It wanted to know why Michael always seemed so frightened whenever he joined. Another account responded by explaining that everyone reacted that way in the beginning. According to the messages, Michael had asked the same questions before, many times. Another version of him admitted that the memories always faded eventually. And one account, using a photograph of Michael at age 70, gently reassured him that he would stop fighting it soon. Weeks passed. Michael stopped going to work, stopped answering calls, stopped leaving his apartment. The group chat had become his entire world, because they were the only people who remembered him. Or at least, that was what he eventually came to believe. Months later, his phone buzzed once again. Someone new had been added. Michael smiled. Another version of himself had joined. At least, that was what he expected. But this time, the profile picture belonged to somebody else. A young man, around 20 years old, completely unfamiliar. The username simply displayed his full name. And beneath the notification, the oldest version of Michael sent the first message. It welcomed the young man to the group and gently asked why he seemed so confused. If you ever find yourself alone in an old group chat or notice names and memories that nobody else seems to remember, do yourself a favor and don't scroll too far back. Some conversations are better left buried. If these stories turned your blood cold, make sure to hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and leave a comment with your own unexplainable experiences. Sleep well tonight, if you can.